afternoon. My name is Craig Rice. I'm one of the programmers for the festival, for the Minneapolis International Film Festival, which is a non-profit, you've all heard this 99 times on these books. It's a non-profit joint. Sign up on the way out in the information office. Part of my responsibility is putting together a series of panels that are really geared toward filmmaking and filmmakers specifically. This panel here has a distinguished group of people here that are primarily editors. It's going to be moderated by a film director, which I really wanted to kind of bring another perspective to it. This is not about how am I going to get to be an editor or what do I need to do to get an editor. This is really talking about the craft and the art form of editing. My whole take on editing has always been that editors are the last writers of a film. As a director, like it or not, the editor is the last person who writes your film, and so picking the right editor for your film is really crucial. It's like finding the cinematographer and finding the right script for your project. The people here that I won't even introduce them because I'll have Eric do that. Eric Tretbar is going to be the moderator for this panel. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you take notes, learn something, and I love each and every one of them. They're great in their own right. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. And I think this nice showing shows that you guys already know the importance of editing. I'm Eric Tretbar, and I've done a number of feature films, mostly in Minnesota. My second film is called Snow, which Dan Geiger was the editor on. So I've had the pleasure of working with him in the editing room, and also another film called GG 12x5, which I actually didn't get to play at this festival. I was out of town for the time. So I learned a ton, and I'm sure all of you who are directors know that you've learned a lot about storytelling, script structure, story structure from your editors. I learned a lot of things I know from Dan Geiger. So Dan has worked on films like Far North, Purple Rain, Herman USA, my film Snow, and most recently, what's the... North Country, and then Dinkytown Uprising, which is here at the festival with Mildred and Fargo. So, I got to hear a bunch of really fun stories about Dan working with a lot of big and amazing editors, and the Coen brothers who started as editors. So I always feel like, from what I've learned from editors, it's kind of like the buck stops here. Everything leads to the editing room, and poor editors have to deal with all of our directorial mess-ups and lack of coverage and bad performances and missed lighting cues and all those things. So we appreciate the editing job. Bill Kersey, who I've just met, is largely a documentary editor, and I'll have some questions about the differences between editing documentaries versus fiction films. And he's worked on the latest film, The Starfish Throwers, American Heart, a number of PBS projects, and right now I heard you're starting, you said, a football documentary?
Well, I'm starting one, but there's also the last film that I edited, Beyond the Divide, is in the festival here, and it's tomorrow or Tuesday.
And then to my right is Lindy Wilson, a longtime editor. She's worked with the Sundance Festival Labs, advising many famous people, and I have a kickoff question for her that I'll save. And let's see, would you like to name some of your projects that you've worked on in the past years?
I just finished, and I'm finishing a film called Dragonfly that is a wonderful film. The director is here, Beth Tronslow, and that is going into final post-production. And I've done some edit doctoring on films like Into Temptation, Exodus, Patterns of Evidence, kind of going in and doing a little fine-tuning for people.
Nice. And a lot of these people also in the Minneapolis film scene work in commercials as well, as a lot of us do. I mean, as we all know, in our film scene, we're largely a commercial film industry, and we're trying as hard as we can, as fast as we can, to create an indigenous fiction and nonfiction industry. So, everyone keep working out there. Congratulations to all your projects. And, I'm recently back in town after being in LA 10 years, and I'm surprised to see how many new filmmakers there are who I've never heard of, because now you can get a camera off Amazon and go make a feature and nobody even knows who you are, until it's done. So I think, I encourage everybody to come to gatherings like this and kind of let's recreate our film community, just because, I think it's exciting. We're making more feature films and short form films in Minnesota than ever before, and yet I don't think we've quite consolidated our scene as we had in the 90s and early 2000s when we had to go to the one and only equipment house, and you met all your friends there. So anyway, it's good to see all of you here. And finally, but not least, Jeff Stickler, who's worked on many local films. I'm sorry, that's another Stickles. He worked on, you worked on Justice, is that right? And, Detective Fiction. So a couple great local directors, Patrick Coyle and John and Jean, and how do you say the last name? I always mess this up. It's, I'll Google this in our version. So, Jeff, do you work mostly in fiction, or do you do some documentary too?
I'm doing a documentary right now called Crack Dice, and mostly I've done a lot of commercials, a lot of corporate work.
And I know that for the movie Justice, which was now, I think, 02, 03? Yeah, and I was involved in that project a little bit too. They were first-time directors, and so they were asking me some advice about directing, and I know that the editing room had many incarnations of the film as they put it together. So anyway, so I'm excited to meet all these guys once again. And I would like to kick off the discussion, a question for Lindy. You've worked with a number of big filmmakers, Quentin Tarantino, one of them, through the Sundance Lab, a lot of people that come through there. And I have a speculation. This is purely in my own director's imagination, just because I know how my films have changed largely in the editing room. And I speculate with my film students sometimes. I'm teaching MCAT. I wonder about Reservoir Dogs. Was this out of order narrative structure a function of, and maybe you can't contractually tell us the answer to this, but you can just raise your pinky if I'm on the right track. Was this out of order structure a function of saving story problems in the editing room, or was it scripted that way?
A lot of it was script changes as you're going to take it.
Oh yeah, microphone.
Oh.
Sorry.
And Sundance, they would take a scene, you pick a scene that they want to go and shoot. And so it's cast, you go and shoot, and they find a room like this and do all these makeshift props and all this. And so you workshop that scene, then you do another scene, and then another scene, and then they have like a table reading of the script. So it's this constant workshop of this feature film in progress. And then Quentin Tarantino was awesome, but he's like, at that time, this was a while ago, of course, when that came out, he was like super hype over like this, and we talk about the video store he worked in, and then there was this ninja movie I saw, and I just loved it, and you'd be just like, oh my gosh, I'm just exhausted. And so he was like super intense, but super enthusiastic about his work, and so he was really open to, well, what if we move the scene around? What if we, this happens first, and then this scene 33 is going to come after 50. So it was a lot of moving the scenes around, which, kind of played with the storyline, and then he would go and rewrite something. So it was a total work in progress.
Interesting. That's cool to hear. And I think, to stay flexible, I think is important for directors. Editors frequently encourage directors to be flexible. Am I right, everybody? But because directors are usually extremely rigid and have a certain thing in mind, but we try, right, guys? Well, this brings me to what Craig Rice alluded to, and this is the mantra I learned, and I teach to all my students. Dan Geiger told me in the editing room that a film is written 3 times: on the page, on the set, and on the editing table. In the old days, now on our editing system, you might say. So, can all of you give us an example? Maybe Dan, I'll start down with you. Talk about a project which changed significantly from the script to the shoot to the edit. And just kind of briefly describe that process.
Your phone. So, but I'm trying to think. Well, the jingle dress I did last year, and the script was like 20 years old, so it had to be updated. So I work with the director to update it, make it contemporary, so we could shoot it without a bunch of problems. And but in the editing room, there weren't any real problems on the set. I storyboarded it, so we wouldn't have any problems. And that was really great, because then it was really easy for me to edit it. I was a script supervisor too, so that helps a lot. But yeah, you know, we got in there and it was, of course, too long. Every film is almost too long, almost, you can guarantee it, feature film. So right away you're trying to figure out how to cut it down. And a lot of that is not just cutting scenes out, but or subplots out, but when you do that, then you got to rearrange the structure. So you're always moving scenes around to make it flow better when you're cutting stuff out. And that was the jingle of the rest.
Did the title did you have a title sequence that changed? That's happened to me probably 3 times.
Well, the first scene of the film, in the script, we moved it like 20 minutes into the film. So it was supposed to be that first scene and then the credits and then the rest of it. And that went out the window right away. You know, we just put the credits in black. And that was it. Then the film started.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eric, well, Dan is talking about jingle dress. Can you then compare it to what happened with, though not in some baseball, but the other people might find it interesting. Dan, were you the second or third editor on Dinkytown Uprising and completely overhauled it pretty much?
The fifth editor. Yeah.
Val's not here to defend, but
Well, that film
that's an
changed.
interesting story, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a documentary, so that's a lot different. But I mean, that film changed every decade because it took 4 decades to make the film. But yeah, that was really difficult because he had a lot of ideas from 1970 about what the film was going to be. And then, but you couldn't make a film out of what he shot in 1970. There wasn't enough footage. So when he started interviewing people, the kids that were there in 1970, started interviewing them in 2005, 2008. So then the film began to change, yeah, with the interviews and the people that he could track down and things like that. So yeah, it was constantly changing till, you know, the last day.
And then I'll add here that editors are fond of, well, they're not fond, but this is just kind of your marching orders with the director. There's a little list, there's a sheet of paper that's taped to the editing room wall, and it's a list of shots that keeps growing as you're assembling the film. And by the time you have your first assembly, there may be, you know, anywhere from 10 to 30 shots, and the director always says, like, what is a shot list here? Do you know what I'm talking about? And they said, oh, well, these are the shots that you don't have. You know, we need a shot of her, like, looking to the right, because she looked the wrong way. She needs to get out of the car. We need her walking the door. We need her, like, flipping the egg, because it's, like, arting the pan. It's like, you can't shoot all these shots. I'm like, okay, if you want this movie to be terrible, go ahead, don't shoot them. And so, somehow or another, you do get the shots that you need. So. But, I mean, this can happen over decades, too, right?
Oh yeah, I went out and shot stuff just a couple of weeks before it was done. That's the great thing about computers now. I mean, it'd be tough on film, but everything's digital, so you can go out and shoot something and an hour later it's in the film.
That I must say that is a nice part of
Helps
it.
a lot.
So can you tell us a little bit, Bill, about how, I mean, documentaries are constantly changing, because you can work on a documentary for, 40 years, as Al shows us, but you can always, you're adding and rewriting the story constantly. Can you talk about your process?
Oh, my process. Okay, this is going to be rough for me because I do not have this systematized at all. I don't really have a process, which is really, or if I do, I'm kind of inventing it every time.
Well, let's say I come to you with something that, like, I have 100 hours of footage, and I say, I just need a really good editor, just kind of, give this thing some shape.
Well, okay, editing can happen. Editing can happen over decades. I mean, documentaries in particular, a lot of times, people talk about how long they take to make, but the films that I've been involved in, the editing has been a minor section of time at the end of that. The way that I work, and I I mean, editors, I think, from my experience, kind of work in isolation. I know that I feel like I haven't had the ability to compare how I work to too many others, and I sometimes feel like I don't know what I'm doing compared to what industry norms there might be. For me, when I'm getting 100 hours of footage, say, and I'm working on the fringes, kind of. I mean, I'm like Jeremiah Johnson out in the woods building a log cabin. I'm not, my facility has been, for the films that I've done, a room down the hall in my house, on my home system, low money. So I like to nail things down when I get that footage, and it's a process that I go through with the director, so that we know what it's going to be, and then we can fulfill that. There's a vision for it, and not. You're building a house of cards, really, and it's really hard during that editing process for me to revamp the story, because then all sorts of stuff falls apart. You got to figure out how to get it back together again. Now, when it's being shot, it's constantly being rewritten, and part of the process that I go through when I start is to turn over every piece so that I see what's there, so that I don't come across something that changes the game after I've already gone down the road a bit. There's one.
So learning your footage is important.
Yeah, one example I could give is there's a film I did that was in the festival here in 2011 that I had, and it was a really funky project. It was shot on film. There wasn't a whole lot of footage. It was only maybe 20 hours or so. And it had actually kind of been on the shelf for a few years because it had been interrupted, was never finished. And it was one of the first films I had done. And I had the footage, and I was working a story and trying to figure out how it should go together. And it was a couple months after I was going through this process when the director, over a meeting at lunch, sort of let slip that, one of the characters has died. And that was the reason why the film actually was interrupted. And to me, that was like an etch-a-sketch, like everything I've been thinking about the project suddenly changed, and it had to be rethought, reconceived from my end. Now, I feel like I'm wandering out of left field a little bit with this, but if things, and that's like a major example of it, like a game-changing piece of information, but when you have a documentary, you go out, you have an idea of what the film is that you want to tell, what the story is you want to tell, the topic you want to investigate. As you go out with the footage, you're not necessarily following a script, so things can change. Jan, who did Beyond the Divide, could talk quite a bit about how stories can change while you're making them because events happen that then you say, that's incredible, I want to follow that.
Or an event happens and suddenly you have a major plot point that suddenly becomes a subplot because the new event is more significant or something.
Yeah.
Film, I decided to shoot another year, even though I thought it was going to be done, because new development and anyone has to follow. And it really became a total shift in what the film's about.
Interesting. And so when you guys, when you sit down with the director who's either you've done pre-production with them or they come in with footage, do you map things out on paper or on a board or cards? Do you actually write down a structure before you start cutting?
Yeah, I actually use an Excel spreadsheet, and I map it out. I sort of subdivide it into chapters, which don't really equate to necessarily how the audience will receive the film in terms of chapters, like a Wes Anderson film, where there's literally chapters, not like that, but just to help me organize the material. Like for Jan's film, we had maybe 25 or 26 chapters, and sort of time them out, figure out where the music's going to go, much of the time what that music is going to be, and sort of really have a roadmap so that I know, when I'm going into it, and I have to plant seeds that will then flower, 2/3 of the way through the film, or set something up that will pay off later on, what those are going to be, because that's just the way I work, and I know that other filmmakers I've heard talk about putting things together and then stepping back and seeing, and maybe it's just because of the fringes that I've been working on, where I just feel like I don't have the luxury to undo stuff and do it again. I want to nail it down, have a vision for it, have it on paper in a way that you can maybe conceptualize it and then fulfill that, so that sort of becomes the script.
Nice. And Lindy, how about you? Have you, what's your process? Because you've done docs and fiction.
Yeah, when I was working on Exodus, I came in again as edit doctor and to bring some dramatic impact to a documentary that they've been working on for over 12 years, and they've been shooting that whole time as well, so there was a massive amount of footage. So it was going through and looking at it and seeing places where you could use graphics to kind of punch it up a little bit, to use some music, to get some emotional impact in a documentary that was very factual. And so moving things and adding music, the graphics really punched it up. And then to go even farther, it was again moving the scenes around. The film I just was working on, Dragonfly, we didn't have the luxury to have a shot list and say, okay, we need this shot, because part of the thing was there was kids in this. And the scenes that really, you know, working with children actors, you know, sometimes the performances just aren't there in the honesty, and, you know, they're waiting to say their line, and so, you know, the chemistry, you might find a shot that, oh, the chemistry's really good here, we need to use this, and we need to work this in somehow. Whether we wanted to be in singles here, yes, but the chemistry's working, so we're going with this. And then the director was really great, Mary Beth, was really great at moving the scenes around, because we had to kind of recut these children's scenes, because of course they're older now, you can't go reshoot this, and putting them in the scenes in different places, because now the scenes were cut, the dialogue had been cut a little bit, so there was a lot of shuffling, and then when you juxtaposition a scene next to another scene, all of a sudden it has a little different meaning, and you find something that works a little better. And you're like discovering things. It was a great process, I thought, of having that freedom, and they weren't like married to every word, because there's some writers that you work with that I wrote that, and that's what they say. That's what they say. You know, well, you have to be loose enough to be able to work with everybody, because, you know, we're all trying here to make this the best it can be, to have the most meaning and still follow your vision.
Yeah, and I think that's one point that I heard you say, that the camera so easily and quickly can communicate what it might take, you know, a page of dialogue to express, that, you know, with Dan and I talked about this many times, that almost all feature films, and a lot of documentaries too, will just cut dialogue, cut the speaking, because the images have already said it. And, you know, in bad movies, they repeat themselves and get redundant. But what percentage of dialogue would you say you routinely cut? Do you have some kind of normal amount?
I don't think there's a normal amount. It depends on somebody you really, really like and get along with. You know, that's part of the process. I think people a lot of times just focus on what have they done? What's their resume? What other films have they done? Would they be good for my film? Well, I think a lot of it is you get even more if you have a good rapport with this person. It's going to be even better. And so I think that's part of the process.
Yeah, it's a husband and wife relationship.
You're very close.
And it changes who's the husband, who's the director, who's the editor. It flip-flops back and forth.
That's true.
Oh, but I have an example of a film that, okay, I was workshopping this film at Sundance, and it was with this director who was really, you know, a good writer. He was more writer than director, and the story was, he was real, you know, adamant about his writing, and it was about two really despicable people. He was just as bad as she was. He was kind of rich, she was kind of poor. They were just horrible people, but it was really good, you know, working on this with these horrible people. They were horrible characters, but you liked them. She was a drug dealer, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good, I can't wait to see it. It came out as Pretty Woman. Yeah, that was my expression too. It's like, wow, that really changed.
So that was rewritten like 15 times.
Yeah, so that's
the
how
charm.
much it can change.
Wow. And Jeff, how about you? Have you had a significant, a big rewrite in the edit?
I don't think it's really a rewrite as it is to get the director to come along and to think out what's already there, and to make, a lot of times they don't like things because of, let's say, I have I'm not going to mention it. The craft services that morning was terrible, and he didn't like anything that day, so he wouldn't even I'm not even gonna look at that stuff, it's junk.
But it was a horrible day, so everything was
It was
horrible.
horrible, everything was horrible, and he wouldn't even, so then it's your job, as Dan said, it's a husband, come on, just look at it, just look at this. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, but then you just keep bringing it back and back, because you have that. I like it because after they leave, you can change it.
And they do. The director sent out lunch, and when he comes back, suddenly there's this whole sequence. And he's like, wow, that's kind of awesome. Like, that's the stuff that you didn't want to look at.
Yeah, it's like sometimes the directors will go, man, his acting is so bad, and it ruins the whole scene. It's just terrible. And I'm like, well, it's not any worse than the rest of the. and they're saying something that you need in your film, some information or something like that.
Well, and this brings us to a good point. I think we all know, looking at footage, you're judging all your footage as you're selecting takes according to a wide variety of criteria, right? There's performance, there's camera, there's lighting, there's rhythm, there's pacing. Is it funny? Is it not funny? Is it in focus? And most of the time, we all know that you tend to select the thing that has the best emotion or performance over the technical. As much as it kills you, like you finally got the dolly move and like 5 or 10 focus marks correct, and then they blow the line. But you go for the performance. So this is a way to say, working in film production most of my life, I always look at different departments, and all departments have their problems, right? We all have our unique problems. Director's problem is, as Ingmar Bergman said, the director's a person who can never tell anybody what they're really thinking. That's how he defined it. Editors actually do get to tell the director, but as you said, with a little gentle nudging. And actors, they're famous for certain problems. So let me start. I'll go back to you. What do you think? What are the problems that you have to deal with the most as an editor? I just think it's kind of fun to think of it as problems. Where do I begin?
Well, I have my own, first of all. Getting out of my own way. I'm in the documentary world, so it's a totally different scenario than working with, footage from a shoot that was scripted. I'm finding footage that will work to tell a story that didn't exist on paper before. So I don't, there are occasionally scenarios where I have options to choose from, but sometimes it's just simply, there's an idea for a scene that might do something, convey a message, get us from this point of the story to this point so that then we can go on. Do I have the raw materials to make that work? Especially since that wasn't on the radar necessarily when it was shot.
And I think this is a good point. I feel like, directors are always imagining this perfect film in their head. But when you get in the editing room, all you have is the shots that you have, right? You didn't get that beautiful shot. No, you didn't get that shot. Or you tried to get the shot, it didn't work. You can't use that shot.
Oh, we did though. We got that.
We got that shot.
I know we had. Where is it?
It's on and today I think it's a lot harder to say you didn't, because when there was film and there was work print and stuff, you knew what you had.
Because as you rewind it, you actually watch it over and over again. And today you skip it.
You skip it.
FYI, guys.
Right. So that's interesting.
We know this is one thing, talking about, you were saying like 20 hours of footage is not very much. When Dan and I did my film Snow, we shot 16. We did over half the film in one take, which I didn't remember. And we had 5 hours of footage.
The whole film was 1 or 2 takes.
Yeah. And as we looked at the dailies, I'm like, where are all these other takes? I know we did these takes. And I was looking at the script notes, and Dan was like, no, look, there's one. I'm like, oh my God. And I was remembering our rehearsals as if we'd run the camera. Now today, shooting digital, I shoot all my rehearsals. So now I've got like 5, 6, 7 takes. I don't have enough time to do more than that. But yeah, you usually get it on, number 1, 2, 3 might be a little better per camera or something, but it's just the same today. But now we shoot the rehearsals more. So do you guys, speaking about digital versus, the old days of film, Has that changed your experience? Has it changed the quality? Has it changed filmmaking? What do you think?
I'd like to address this issue. Because of digital and electronic editing, everyone thinks that that's faster. And it's not. Everyone goes, yeah, it's not. I know it's not. But they still, their expectations are that they're going to be that it's faster. And when you're sitting there, you know, looking at every nuance of every eye move, you know, because in the eyes, you find that look, you find that glance over that can make the whole scene work. That could be the huge payoff. But it takes a lot of time to look at all those. And especially if you're looking at the stuff before the camera rolls, or if somebody's, you know, looking down and then they go like this and they're, you know, looking at their script before the camera rolls, you know, it takes time to find that. And I think there's a big misconception, and everyone agrees, yeah, I know it's not faster. But their expectations are still that it's faster. So I think the biggest enemy of editing is time.
Well, producers think it's faster. We know that. And, you know, here's a little historical nugget. When Abbott's came in, and, you know, later than we think, in the mid-90s, they were sold not to editors, they were sold to producers. And the Abbott people came in. I went to college with one of these guys. I was like, yeah, it's great. I go to the producer, like, hey, dude. He didn't say dude then, but anyway, you know, just like, you know, you got a computer? It's on the computer, just, and you went a different version, and he's like, whoa, really? Yeah. Like, cut your time in half. Like, sign me up. I'll take 5
Yeah, the producers did that because they would have more control that way. They could see rough cuts, like, because traditionally, you know, a director and the editor wouldn't even want to show it to the producer because they were just meddling, and they would give them notes and they would throw them out anyway. So, but the producers wanted more input, more control, and that's computers gave it to them.
So in a way, the efficiency that computers create, in a way, makes it too easy to spit out a cut that someone can watch.
Yeah, that's
It's
the problem. They don't come to you anymore. They don't come to your editing room. I don't have anybody in my editing room, hardly ever. I go, oh, send it over here and put it on Hightail or whatever, and then they get notes back. Oh, they missed the whole point of that, you know.
Then it also gives the misconception, I think, that, you know, because the tools are readily available, I can get somebody cheaper, quicker, somebody that, you know, will do it faster than you. And my thought is, just because you can use a hammer doesn't mean you can build a house.
Yes, here. Well, I mean, what I learned, you know, let's just quickly walk through for everybody the basic editing process. How many weeks to cut picture, how many weeks to cut sound, how many weeks for finishing, just for people that don't know this process.
Average is like 10 to 12.
Well, 10 to 12.
It depends on if you're talking about a doc or
Yeah, let's say on
or
a fiction
narrative.
feature that's a scripted
Yeah.
feature. 10 to 12 per picture,
Yeah,
about the same for sound.
about 5 or 6 weeks for sound. It depends on how many guys you have to do
Right,
it.
and if, I mean, Crouching Tiger is going to be months,
Yeah.
not weeks, but
It's like, yeah, 8 weeks. I tell people 8 to 12 weeks to cut the picture, and then 4 or 5 weeks for the sound. And then you got music and mixing is going to take a week or two, depending on how many tracks you have. Then you got color correcting, and yeah, is that 4 months? If you don't stop.
that's a full-time job, we hope. So I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, but maybe you guys can tell us some good relationships you've had with the director. Talk a little bit more about the relationship between the editor and the director. Is there anything that we missed here? Any nuggets of
I
wisdom
haven't
for-
had any good relationship. Just you, Eric.
I mean, I think there's, you know, kind of like being in a band with people that you don't quite get along with all the time, or, you know, any romance. I mean, there's going to be friction, but I do think you know, a director and a DP are frequently, you know, a little friction there. But I think it's usually good friction.
Yeah, I think that it's good if it's somebody that you can establish a relationship with early on, get to know them, where you're working together when they're in the room or you're working apart. You can sort of start seeing the director's vision and wanting to find those performances and, you know, in the rough cut stage to kind of get to know each other and like, oh, wow, I can't believe that really looks great. Or, you know, I don't feel like the character is coming across like I thought it would. And you're starting to get to work on those rough cuts right off the bat, not the scene order or anything. But then you start to kind of like jive together, you start to work together, you start to think about what they want out of their film and start to put their vision into the film, because you're closer. It's not like, oh, I'm just doing this job, okay, what do you think? You know, because you're there together for so long, you start this relationship. Don't you think, Mary Beth? Yes.
Well, it's also their film.
Yeah.
It's not mine, even though some days. But we've come in really late, and that's another thing I like to say is that the sooner you bring an editor on your project, the better off you're going to be, because we're usually a voice of reason. Some days.
Well, and so, you know, Billy Wilder, Dan and I were just talking, you know, frequently brought his editor on and kept him around for good luck, right?
Well, yeah, after you actually learn how to direct a film. I mean, I knew how to write a script, but first time you tried directing, it was a total disaster. So we brought the editor in to help him.
But I think it's interesting to consider that, you know, all the shots you're shooting on a set are shot to be puzzle pieces that fit together in a certain way. And, you know, so if you work from the back and work backwards from what you need, you'll, you know, create your workflow.
Well, that's, yeah, I talk to people a lot about that. I mean, I was a cameraman when I started. I went to art school, I studied photography, and then shooting was really easy for me, but what was really mysterious was editing and directing. So in the 80s, I wanted to learn how to be a director, so I thought the best way to do that here in Minneapolis at the time was to be an assistant editor. So I would work on commercials once in a while. Jeff hired me a couple of times. He was a producer for a while. And then I'd get a job on a feature as an assistant editor, and that's how I learned. And that doesn't happen a whole lot anymore, being an assistant or an apprentice. And so you learn everything from, I learned from all these other editors from LA and New York. That was really valuable. But what you learn is that editing is, it's the same as directing, really. You just do it at a different time in the process, because, you know, you don't want to, there's not a separation between directing and shooting a film and then editing. It's all interlaced, you know, that's the main thing.
Yeah, except with editing, your pieces are set, and you're
Yeah.
you're organizing them in time and space. But that's what you're doing with actors too. You're organizing them in time and space.
It's all connected anyway. So.
Yeah. Victoria, question?
As you were talking about like how you brought in like your you brought like bringing in your editor even though you technically didn't need him at that time. Have you guys ever thought of bringing like how you were talking about like I guess kind of building a relationship with your director and everything? Have you ever thought of like I guess spending time outside of work with the director to try to? I know that like you probably wouldn't want to because you don't want to bring
go there.
you don't want to bring the work with you, but I mean like I guess kind of spending time that you can. So
Well, yeah, you should be friends, and you should be on speaking terms.
Yeah, and there are a few historical examples that are a little more fraught. Eisenstein had, I think, 2 or 3 paternity suits slapped on him from assistant editors. I read somewhere.
Yeah,
well, that's pretty rare.
Well, the Coen brothers, the reason, you know, the Coen brothers were going to edit Fargo themselves, but of course they're on the set shooting it, so they wanted somebody here in Minneapolis that had a lot of experience to handle the editing room and everything. So that was me. There wasn't really anybody else at that time. That was 1995. And, you know, but they were going to edit Fargo because they had just got done working on Hudsucker Proxy, I think, and Tom Noble, who was an Australian, was the editor. If you look at the film credits, he's the editor, but they told me that they hated him, and after a certain point, they wouldn't let him in the editing room, and they just said, you know, they were editing in New York, they just said, go to lunch, go shopping, don't come back. You still get your paycheck, but we're going to edit the film. That was Hudsucker, so. or Miller's Crossing, I can't.
Just to
remember.
remind people, I mean, the Coens started as editors, so I think, you know, for you
Yeah,
film students out there.
Joel did as an assistant for Sam Raimi.
But it's, you know, they think about a film from the editing point of view, like what are the
Sure.
things we need. If it doesn't work, we reshoot.
Yeah.
Then we make the pieces correct. Then they fit together, and everything's fine.
Yeah, they started
Very
as
logical.
teenagers. Yeah.
You know, and one thing I see teaching now is really interesting. A lot of my students will enter college already being competent editors, understanding the basic film language, shot, reaction shot, establishing point of view, you know, intercutting, parallel, montage, you know, pretty sophisticated stuff. But the thing that students usually don't have experience doing is actually making the shots. It's like, well, I just pull it all off, you know, from online. But to go out and light it and focus it and direct actors, that's the hard part. So I think it's kind of cool. I mean, editing is actually, it's widespread because everyone grows up on computers and everyone's got some kind of software. Have you guys met younger editors coming up like this? Have you noticed this phenomenon?
Follow it along.
Yeah, I work alone now, even though I worked as an assistant for 15 years on big features in between small features, local features that I was editing.
But, and I think this is worth remarking that, you know, a lot of different people in film production, there are kind of certain temperaments or personalities that, you know, go to different places. Assistant directors are, you know, Craig Rice. He's like loud and authoritative voice, and people do what he tells them to do. And you know, animators are famously very private and, you know, introverted people sometimes. And I think editors are frequently, you know, kind of private people too. The ones that I've known. And do you got? Are there some like party monster editors out there that we don't know about?
No.
My daughter's here. Come on, Jeff.
As an aside, I was just gonna mention, I was just thinking, it's really probably only the last, maybe Dan can comment on this, or anybody can, in the last maybe 40 years where editors are even kind of recognized, like it was Dede Allen with Jaws, with Thelma Schumacher, with Scorsese's films. Before that, editors were almost kind of like there, and if I'm correct, the very earliest, maybe the first 30 or 40 years, it was seen as kind of a lowly job, and I know this is sexist, but
Yeah,
a lot of
women-
editors,
No,
it was
it's
almost
totally
seen as
sexist,
like
yeah.
a sewing machine.
Exactly.
Taylor.
Well, they had to use really early, they just used projectors
Right.
and scissors and glue it together. But then when the upright moviola was invented, it was more physical. You had to like beat it like a horse or something in the 30s, 20s and 30s, and then I think it was more men maybe. But you know, like David Lean was an editor, and he became a director, and there's been a lot more really good directors come around that start off editing because they are so interconnected.
I'm gonna get back to that question you were talking about, noticing with younger editors, and the editing language is much more well-known now over the last 10 years with the availability of technology. But I still think that knowing how to build the complexity of a character and have a simple story, knowing how to show those complexities of the character, how do you use that with foreshadowing, and how do you use that in the deeper language of film, I think is something that there's no book you can read or class you can take. I think you get a lot of that with experience with using the footage and building something to show the complexities of the character, showing the emotional range of that person. That, I think, is a bigger challenge.
Yeah, and so let's talk about exactly how you build some of those characters. I think on a kind of micro scale, within a scene maybe, there are beats within a scene where you're seeing emotional, you know, positive, negative, back and forth. But then, you know, through sequences or through acts, how much do you guys think about story structure, act breaks, and plot points, and kind of turns like that? And do you hope that the script is good enough to have that inherent in it, or do you have to create these things sometimes?
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell a real quick anecdote with Dan, in my second screenplay, I didn't know act structure very well. And so I wrote 3 30-minute acts, not knowing that Act 2 is longer than Act 1 and 3. Usually twice as long. It's kind of like 1 to 2 to 1, roughly. So I had 1 to 1 to 1. And so the love scene, which should be the midpoint scene, yeah, you turn to page 50, page 60, in the 120-minute script. It was more like the end of Act 2, where I put it. And Dan's like, Eric, what? This is way too late. This is gonna have to come earlier. It can't be earlier. They haven't even like had coffee yet. I'm like, well, they're gonna have coffee earlier too.
Yeah.
Why don't you move that earlier?
Well,
Yeah.
you had like a 1 hour first act, as I recall, and
Yeah.
that had to be cut down. And then the third act was really minimal, so that didn't get cut down at all, I don't think.
Well, and to be brutal, there was no Act 3. This is a common
Well, I
problem
made
that I
one.
see.
I sort of made one out of what you sort of had, and I took stuff out of the first act.
It was an
Made
80-minute
the
film,
third act.
82-minute film, and it ends, all hope is lost at the end of Act 2, the end. Seriously. And you see this in so many indie films, because I think young screenwriters like me, like a lot of us, were afraid to have that final battle, like they're gonna go and get back together or whatever. It's like, no, it's just sad. Have you guys seen this?
Well, I've seen independent films by first-time writer-directors that the whole film is the first act.
That too.
The main character doesn't do anything until the end of the movie, and doesn't make any decisions or doesn't drive the story until, the end of the film, and that doesn't work at all.
And yes, some of the greats do take structural risks, like Kosowski in the movie Blue. The whole movie is really a reaction shot to the car crash at the beginning. It's like a woman loses her husband and child, sorry, spoiler, in the car crash, and the entire movie she grieves and kind of comes back to the surface. So, that's a really small amount of story, really, and yet it's masterfully done. Have you guys either worked, you've all worked on different kinds of things, minimalist things or maximalist things? Is it easier or harder to work with like a lot of story, like big narrative arcs, or small, delicate things?
Well, I don't know, they're both equally hard for different reasons, I think. If you have a whole bunch of scenes and a whole bunch of footage, that's difficult. You gotta, like one editor told me one time that I worked with, he's like, he said he told the director one time, yeah, there's a big pile of horse shit here, and I saw there's got to be a pony in there somewhere. That was his job. But then, like your film, like Snow, was very minimal, and we had 1 take or 2 takes, and that's hard to edit too, because you have nowhere to go. There's no coverage. There's no.
Yeah, we had 4 or 5 shots per scene, on average. Well, let's talk a little bit. Is Craig around here? Are we going to 5? I can't remember our time here.
Yeah,
Fine, okay. Well, let's a couple last discussions here. I want to end with, for some people starting out, how they might get into the editing room or get into editing if they're interested. But let's quickly have a discussion about special effects and maybe mapping out that workflow with the director, or how you guys work with special effects. Just because it's becoming so commonplace, it's even in tiny indie films now. Just because Premiere can kick out these things that look great with not a lot of trouble. So
It's amazing what you can do sitting at home. It scares me, but I still like to turn it over to somebody that really knows what they're doing. I like to build it, give them as much as I can, and maybe she can, they're just so much more talented than I am at that, because I don't have time. It's time, time and money, and so if someone can do it faster, give it to her and we'll let her run with it.
So that's
I'm not going to sit at a piano and try to score the film.
Right.
The same thing with that. So hopefully the director has thought about it before they come in, so you've got all the blocks and pieces. That's pretty.
And that you're working with an animator or a compositor or somebody that is
Yeah.
doing the graphics, and that you can kind of like get like audition files to put in, and how do you think this is working? Is this helping the scene before the animator is gonna put in, you know, a week's worth of work, and then you go, this sucks, I'm not gonna use this. You know, you want a little like temp stuff that you can put in to just start looking at it and working with the animator, and again, you have a rapport with the animator so that you're both on the same page, because they're pretty far removed from the film, other than just like maybe watching the rough cut. So they don't know some of the issues and some of the problems, so it's more than just having them look at your film. It'd be, you know, letting them know a little bit of history about what it took to get it here, you know, and letting them know that what they're doing, what they're creating, the animation that they're putting on it really is gonna be this role, or we want it for this feeling, and go into depth instead of, oh, we need some leaves coming out here. You know, it's easy to say that because that's what they're gonna do, they're gonna go with leaves coming out. But what if it's like, okay, she just, you know, lost her mother, she's, you know, sad, the leaves are representing whatever. You know, so they have a little bit of history, but I think in the process, because they're not there all the time, they don't know what's going on in the film at that point as much as you would think they should.
So in a way that the director is directing the special effects, the way that they're directing the actor with motivation and how it works in the whole piece. I always think actors always want to know when they're doing a scene, what has happened just before the scene, what's happened just after the scene, so they can know where they are emotionally and go from, you know, 5 to 7 or something. And I think it's always the director who's like trying to, you know, maybe alone has the overall picture of how all these puzzle pieces fit together, and ideally, the editor too has that same vision and scheme in mind. Do you guys have any special effects things that you've run across? Do you use anything?
No, I mean, minimal stuff, nothing that I feel like my work would have anything to comment on.
Yeah, I was just kind of trained the traditional Hollywood way. You know, if you wanted some effect, you talk to the effects house. You know, they did it for you, and get it back. Tell them whether it was any good or not, how to change it. And it's just, you know, that's a whole other world, whole other universe. So I don't do much of it at all. I just get somebody else to do it. But, you know, low budget feature films, you don't have a call for a whole lot of effects usually.
But you're starting to see, you know, green screen used for really rudimentary kind of pedestrian shots, like 2 people walk out a door and have a, you know, 4 or 5 line conversation, and then cut to the next location. And frequently, now with this thrown in front of green screen, I mean, I prefer to go on location myself, but if you can say like 50 people going with the company move and just shoot it in the studio, and it's just like a few lines, I mean, people are doing that all the time. So, I mean, that's, you know, if you're not into effects, you know, that's just how it is. So let's wrap up here, and thank you guys so much for being here. I love to see editors out there. Oh yes, sorry, go ahead.
What would you say are a few things that a director can do with their editors that will have best return on their time to, you know, facilitate your processing the story stronger and talk about, you know, puzzle making, you mentioned storyboarding, for instance, reading script, you know, what would be those top things in your mind?
I thought one thing that is really helpful that I've done in the past is to sit in on table readings when they do a reading with the actors that they think they're going to have in the film. You know, sometimes they do those, the audition process too. And I thought that was really helpful because hearing how the actors voicing those characters then gives you something to meet with the director and talk about, and that kind of puts you on the road, you know, to this is where we're going, and then you can hear what the as an editor, you can hear what the director's vision is, and if you have any information or anything you feel like you could help support that with. But I thought the table read, going to that before anything started was really, really helpful.
Yeah, and if you can watch the director directing, then you got a leg up on how he's thinking and how things are going to be shot. But yeah, I think talking about, other than storyboarding, I mean, I've storyboarded half a dozen films, I think, because I told the director I didn't want to edit it unless it was storyboarded, because it just, I don't know, I didn't have much confidence in him, I guess. And then, of course, they don't, it's like, well, why don't you storyboard it? I'm like, okay. which you don't want to do. You don't have to do that. But the other thing is talking about coverage. You know, how are you going to cover each scene? Which is storyboards tell you, but a lot of times they don't get storyboarded. So at least talking about the coverage, you know, how many shots are going to be shot for this scene, and how is it going to be covered, and things like that. Anything at all that helps, you know, speed up the process.
Well, I think just in general, hearing you guys say these things, I'm reminded of a John Frankenheimer movie from the 60s, Grand Prix. It's a race car movie. Frankenheimer was very insistent that all the car sounds be correct. I mean,
I remember that movie, that's why I was, oh my
and
goodness.
the editing room of this movie, it was like the most expensive film ever made to date, you know. And they had 4 editing rooms, and they were like, you know, one is 1 month ahead of the next one. They were building like one reel in each room. It's just insanity. I don't think they saw the whole movie before it was printed, you know. But yeah, it's a very long movie. But the sound editor was asked to come to location and create a catalog of engine sounds of each race car, so they would all be correct, like accelerating, decelerating, left turn, right turn, approaching, going away. You hear a lot of sound work, you know, with either sounds that you heard in other movies before, and they're kind of phony baloney, or they don't match the car or whatever. But I think to have that kind of attention to detail is music to editors' ears, and especially if you get involved in the production, so that you know that you're going to have the correct pieces.
Oh yeah, the sound effects are really important, and if they're correct, if they're real. A lot of times, what I found is real effects aren't as good as what you might be able to buy or do Foley or something else. But yeah, if you have all the stuff ahead of time, it helps a lot.
Yeah. So, some questions, anybody? Yes.
Have any of you found a successful way to negotiate the boundaries between editor, colorist, and DP?
No, I've had a lot of fights with DPs. I mean, and I've seen fist fights between editors and DPs on a couple of films I've worked on.
Who wins, usually?
Well, the director is the final say. I mean, but if the director's not strong enough, if the editor and the DP have way more experience than the director, which seems to be happening more and more, yeah, then it's a fist fight. But I don't know, it's difficult.
I mean, I think that's one of the jobs of directors is to kind of keep everyone working together, and I think the director, you know, frequently sets the tone. I mean, I think they should set the tone on the set, in post too. Sometimes there's a powerful producer that's, you know, telling the director what to do, but I think, you know, on smaller films, you as a director really have to, you know, lead the way and try to get everyone to make the same movie.
Yeah, it was just kind of piggybacking on Anna's question about like sort of helpful things to know between editor and director, but from back, you know, regarding documentaries.
Yeah, because documentaries are totally, I mean, I'm feeling really challenged at finding ways to frame my thoughts in ways that don't suddenly take the conversation about narrative films and turn it on its head, because it's a totally different animal. But it's, you know, having a realistic expectation of the time, especially that time to find the story, and not, you know, not take a film that has been however long in the making and presume to, you know, turn around a rough cut really quick and then go from there and see how that works and change. No, I mean, and some of this is very specific to my process too, I know, because I you know, time is, I don't remember who said it, somebody here said that time is the enemy of the, yes. And it's not, it's the enemy of creativity too, for me, and it's the enemy of psychological health. So to feel like, I mean, because for me there's something that I've referred to as cruising altitude when I'm working in documentary, where if I can get into the material and start looking at it without, I mean, as an editor, you know, you're kind of as a proxy, and it's really, it's hard to sort of, oh boy, this is going to be tricky, to shut down a lot of those filters that you have, and to not be looking at it through the audience's eyes. I mean, that's tricky, because you do want to be looking at it through the audience's eyes, but to to not even necessarily always be looking at it through the director's eyes. You can just sort of get to the material and find out what's there and think about what can work. And then when you're putting it, I'm just rambling off the left field, I'm sorry. When it's an overwhelming process. For me, on documentaries, I've done over half a dozen, and every one seems to be a little more overwhelming than the last. And it's really hard to maintain faith that it's even achievable, to find something that will work, that you can pull a sustained story that's going to carry people along for 80, 90 minutes out of this mountain of footage. I mean, you can, when those, oh boy, I am drifting.
Is there something that would make it less overwhelming?
Well, having what's that?
An idea.
Having an idea.
Yeah, I mean, have you had a director come to you and say, like, here's what the story is, and here are the kind of parts 1, 2, and 3, like in a very organized way, or not?
In many cases, I mean, there's certain things that are dictated just by the chronology of what was shot. I mean, there are certain things that, well, this is going to be the final act because it's this big thing that happened. I've had situations where, you know, there was an outline, but then it ended up being a list of footage that was shot, and it wasn't really structured in terms of a journey for the audience. It was just a catalog. And I've come on some projects where I haven't been the first editor, and so there's been like attempts to go one direction, and then I come in and it's like, let's go back to 0 or 5, because you might find some ideas that you can use from the previous direction. So it's, but there's always something that they want the story to do. So part of the process, I mean, I don't think at all that you should just take the footage and go away in a room, you know, because I think that it needs to be a dialogue with the director. I mean, they have something that they want that to do. And, you know, what the DP is for the image, you could think of the editor, especially in documentary, as being for the storytelling. Okay, so there's all this footage, and it was shot without, for the most part, without any sense of where in the story it might fall. It could come at the beginning, it could come at the end, it could come in the middle. What's the best way to sequence this material? So having, I've lost the thread here.
Bill, to help you out, I just saw Thicker Than Water, and that's exactly what you said had happened, that they pretty much gave you the loads of 20 hours, and they didn't even have much storyline. It was just a story of the boy who was the hockey player who had a disease. You forgot what the disease was, the blood thinning?
Hemophilia, yeah.
Hemophilia.
Well, and that was the one that I was talking about.
That's
But
what
one of the
I think.
characters, just really help the editor turn over those pieces so that they know what's there. Because going through 20 hours is nothing really. But I mean, some films that have 80, 100,
Still, you said
150.
the director did not give you much to go on, except just here's the footage, right?
Well, yeah, and I would recommend, for exactly this reason, that, you know, anyone thinking about a documentary who's not an experienced documentary maker, read your screenwriting books, Story by Robert McKee.
Yeah, that's right.
You need to know story just as much as a
Yeah.
screenwriter. And I think a lot of people set off on a doc just like, oh, I don't really know about actors and screenwriting, so I'm just going to start shooting.
Or
This
wrote a book on editing, like Walter Murch.
Walter Murch, yeah.
Well, the three,
Tarkovsky's not going to help you probably, so save that for later. But yeah, I think, I mean, me as a director and screenwriter too, I think story structure is everything. And if you come to an editor with story structure in mind, and as you're shooting it as a doc maker, you're already placing these things in certain possible places. Like, ooh, this could be a good midpoint scene. And they may shift, but just to kind of know what the fence posts are.
yeah, I mean, it goes back to Aristotle. You know, there's a certain way. That's where the 3X structure comes from. And the good docs that I've seen, it's structured a lot like a feature film. I mean, it has 3 acts. It has characters.
Yeah.
It has turning points, plot points, it has subplots, and like the 3 feature docs that I just did in the last 4 years, Dinkytown, Uprising, and one about Pete Seeger and his wife. Yeah, I just, and my background is narrative film making and editing, so those were really difficult projects, like the Dinkytown film. You know, there were 4 other editors that tried to put it all together. It was a mess. Everything was just all, didn't make any sense, the other rough cuts. So I'm like, well, you know, it's a story. You set up the characters, set up the conflict, then it's the whole second act is the conflict getting worse and worse and worse, and then the results of the
Blow up the Death Star.
yeah, and that helped me a lot to structure it with just a regular story.
Yeah, and I want to try this back to tie it back to the question a little bit. I actually feel like that can only make the film better if the director has those things in mind. I feel I'm less concerned about that because when you get 80, 100 hours of footage, I've worked on some films where I had to really find creative ways of pulling things together to make things work. So, if they have, I mean, the more they can bring to the table, the better. But I mean, that's kind of the heavy lifting that I kind of like to do. But don't underestimate how long it takes, would be the suggestion from the director's point of view. In terms of, you know, I mean, don't expect, like, here's a bunch of footage, gonna have a rough cut in 6 weeks. You know, I mean, if you have 80 hours, 100 hours of footage, how long is it? For me, I want to go through all of it so I know what's there, because it's the little nuances that it's those little discoveries that sometimes become, you know, that little, what's the little rock that pearl forms around it? Yeah. Well, the grain of sand, yes. And it is in finding, it's not just, oh, there's this piece, there's this piece, there's this piece, but it's the accumulation of there's this piece and there's this piece and there's this piece, and together those three things can help build something that then other things can be attached to. And that takes time, and time takes money, so funding would be the other thing, be funded. And then I mean, just for me, my own personal, I really love to feel like this is a dialogue with the director, because you know, I hope that's how it comes off with the director. And even though I tend to work, you know, kind of off on my own and try to, you know, do my cooking and then come out, I always want to make sure that I'm not driving the director's project, you know, out into some direction. I mean, it's their film. They're the ones who went out and sometimes traveled the world to shoot this footage. They have the passion, especially in documentary, for the arguments, the themes, the ideas that are going to be in that film. So the story is not the end game in the documentary. It should serve what the director wants that film.
And that's another thing, during the process, as an editor, the director gets input from people. They want to show the rough cut to somebody, they're showing it to investors, they're showing it to so-and-so or whatever. Part of the job of the editor is a little bit psychologist and a little bit cheerleader. You know, bartender, okay. You know, say, you know what, you worked so hard on this film, let's focus on your vision, let's get back to what your vision is. You can get all this advice from all these experts, but you're really, you know, staying true to your vision helps them helps the director stay energized, stay focused, stay positive, and that's part of the job as the editor as well.
That's excellent, by the way. I want to jump on that because I think it's important for the director to not let the chorus of voices that will, you know, be in their ear, and sometimes, and you know, you should invite it, but there should be reasons why you do things, and then they should be good reasons. And if you gather feedback from people, you can easily be steered one way or another. So have a real strong sense about that, so that other people don't change the film to the film that they would make if they were you, but they're not you. You're you, so make the film you want to make.
Okay, we got to wrap this up. I think we're just about over time. One more quick question and then.
You were just mentioning psychology as a for editing. How do you relate psychology and film editing for you personally?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, it's a relationship, and there's psychology in a relationship, and you're kind of, I feel like, a guide for that director. They're entrusting you with something that's very valuable, and you are there to help see their idea come to fruition. And so, even though I think this scene's better, or this take's better, or this performance is better, you know, ultimately it's always going to be their film. And then they do get a ton of advice. And at Sundance, the pressure for those filmmakers was so intense. These people got their chance to be at Sundance and working on these scripts. And then, you know, George Roy Hill comes in and says, you know what, I don't like that. I think you should do this. Or, you know, so they had really high-profile people coming in. D.D. Allen would come in and say, you know, and so they're under a lot of pressure. And that's where I was like, oh, wow, this is gonna take some, they've just got two people in a row giving two contradictory pieces of advice, and now I think he's gonna cry. And so I'm like, okay, well, you know what? We're gonna work on this. Let's look at the footage and what was it that you have to get back to the original idea. What are we doing and how do you incorporate all this great advice? It is great advice, but it's still his film.
Directors really get scared. The more scared, the closer you get to getting it done. They'll go slower and slower and slower, and the editor's job is to keep it moving and get it done. It's hard sometimes.
Yes.
I used to be an editor many years ago in the film days. One of the things I used to tell the director is that I bring a constructive ignorance to the project. You know what you intended to express in the scene, and that's what you see. All I see is what's on my screen. And if I don't see it, there's a chance the viewer isn't going to see it. Maybe I'm being obtuse, but I think I'm as smart as
That's a great point. And the way I
and
said
that way I didn't say, I'm not trying to double, I know better than you. I'm just saying, I don't get it.
all you've got is the shots that you've got. But to interpret those shots, the director can definitely be blind because they're bringing in what I wished I would have done. So hey, if you can stick around and chat with these people a little bit more, but I want to thank everybody, Jeff, Lindy, Bill, and Dan, and let's give them a round of applause.